Hello, this lecture will focus on incarceration of young Black men in the US. And I want to let you know that I um, will be providing information about young middle adulthood. But as graduate students, I want to leave you this information here and want to invite you to academically explore yourselves. I just want to guide and facilitate, and I want to take for you to take this information and consider what it means for you and your practice and explore different resources related to this topic. So just an overview of what I will be covering. I will touch on race, policy in courts and corrections, and the effects of incarceration. I will be talking about young and middle adulthood, and I will provide some recommendations. So I want you to think about what it means for African Americans in this context during young and middle adulthood and the intersection of race, policing, courts, and corrections, and how that may interrupt their young and middle adulthood. So African Americans represent 13% of the population, but they represent 22% of fatal police shootings. So we may hear that whites are also shot, but they make up 60% of the population and only around 40% of the fatal shootings. So the importance is found in the disproportionality of African Americans being shot fatally at a much higher rates than they represent the population. So if you work with African American boys, you can know that a third of African American boys born today will go to prison, as opposed to 1/6 of Latino boys and 1/17 of white boys. So if you work with African American boys, 1/3 of them will be in jail. Imagine that. Think about those same boys that by the age of 14, 25% of them, or a fourth of African American children, will experience parents being in prison. So 1/4 will experience losing a father to incarceration. So imagine the emotional and financial implications of that. And usually they are not related to violent crimes. Only a third are related to violent crimes. So they are pulled from their families and children, not due to violence. And this has major ramifications for African American families. And 5% of illicit drug users are Black, yet Blacks represent 20% of those arrested and 33% of those incarcerated for drug offenses. This shows that African American don't use drug at rates different from whites, yet again, they are arrested and incarcerated at much higher rates. And of 1,900 exonerations of wrongfully accused, 47 of these were African Americans. So we are seeing a very high rate of African Americans being accused. African Americans make up about 13% of the African American population, and 35% of the individuals executed over the last 40 years have been African Americans. So effects of incarceration, 10 to 20% of those who have been incarcerated suffer from severe or serious mental illness. And people who are incarcerated are 5 times more likely to be positive for HIV. They are more vulnerable to disease and more likely to have premature death They are excluded from benefits also, depending on the state. So once released, they may not be eligible for programs such as SNAP or food stamps. And it does not only affect them, but also their children and families that they are returning to. So those who have been incarcerated experience difficulty getting a job, housing, education. About 75% of those who have been incarcerated are unemployed after almost a year after being released. 75% don't have a job a year later. A lack of stable employment increases the chances that a person will return to jail a few years later. We have about 650,000 people released from prison each year, and half of those end up in prison within just a few years. And not having a job is the single most common predictor that someone will return to prison. Anything that you can do to support someone to get a job after being incarcerated is extremely important. And children of incarcerated parents are almost likely to drop out of school themselves. They are likely to be suspended from school. They are also more likely to be diagnosed from learning disabilities. For example, they are 48% more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. They are 33% more likely to have a speech or language issues. They are more likely to suffer from psychological strain like anxiety of PTSD, and they are more likely to engage in criminal behavior themselves. Additionally, they have all kind of health issues. They are more likely to experience migraine and asthma. And their partners are also more likely to experience economic and emotional hardships. And it's one of the reasons why children are more likely to experience homelessness, and parents are more likely to experience this depression as well. So young adulthood, typically during this stage, people are biologically at their peak. So physically, their change may start to happen in their 30s and decline during their 40s and 50s. And in early generations, people would start a family earlier, and now people are delaying it for various reasons, such as pursuing higher education or a career. And financial independence is more likely to be a signal of young adulthood rather than marriage or kids. And now some individuals are delaying this due to pursuing a career. And generativity is described differently for African Americans compared to white, and regards and often included political and civic engagement, public service, and religious engagement. So let's look at the textbook and previous stage-based theories and what they say about young and middle stage of development. So in the early years, according to Young, in this stage, according to Young, there's a breakaway from the parents. And Levinson also says that it is time to develop relationships, maybe community ties. And Levinson emphasizes a potential to move geographically and become potentially independent. And it is a future of young adulthood. And some of these theories pose that there is a switch later in middle young adulthood that is more productive oriented. So the person may solidify characteristics of what they seem important to a generation of contribution more towards middle adulthood. And it is important to note that privilege or a family's access to financial capital and social support obviously has an impact on the ability for young adults to access various opportunities during this stage of life, such as being able to pay for childcare, obtain a higher education degree, or other things. And aside from privilege, there's capital and opportunities. So now let's go back to some of the statistics that we went over in the previous slides. So Black men are incarcerated at 6 times the rate of white men. So Black men are likely to be in this stage of life. So what does it mean for them? Um, they are faced with intimacy versus isolation, an Erickson stage. Which one do you think that's going to go for them? And generativity versus stagnation. What opportunities are there to meet families' responsibilities and career connections to the community? This is a major interruption at a crucial stage in life, and it doesn't just affect the young middle Black men that are in prison, it also affects their partners and children who often manage without their support, without a father figure, and without the financial support they are able to offer. So here are some recommendations of various levels of social work. At the micro level, there's a need for school-based programs for children with incarcerated parents. In Los Angeles, there's a program called POPS Clubs, which stands for Pain of Prison Systems. And it has students engaged in creative expression, self-expression, and self-healing, and also community engagement where they might engage and with outside speakers, including people who have experience with incarceration of a loved one. And additionally, there's a Big Brother, Big Sister that have programs that have been applied in some locations and have implemented programs for children of incarcerated parents. And it's something that we can also look into in our states. And at the demographic level, it is important at the meso level for teachers to receive education about the prevalence and demographic realities who are likely to have a parent who are incarcerated, such as stigmatization, and that those children encounter. And you don't have to call them out, but it is important to be aware of the realities and refer them to necessary supports, such as to social workers, mental health providers. And at the family level, teachers need to recognize that parents are not disinterested in their kids. It is just that they are facing social realities that don't allow them to be super engaged, and they may also need to be connected to resources such as transportation or need childcare or things like that. At the macro level, you need enormous resources to address this. However, there could be rehabilitation programs for those who have not committed nonviolent offenses, ones that could allow them to still be present for their families. In some states, such as South Carolina, bar food stamps, SNAPs, and cash assistance to those who have received drug charges. And the Center for Law and Social Policy has a list of states that banned and those who don't. And these programs that help people with their very basic needs, and not just the needs of themselves, but also their children. And just a fact, 70% of people on probation experience food insecurity compared to 13% of the general population. So I hope this presentation was informational and that you are able to apply it to your work with populations during this stage of life, and that you're able to understand the intersectionality of populations such as African Americans and the challenges that they experience, and what kind of support you can provide to them to overcome some of the challenges that they are experiencing during this stage in life.